Welcome to the Unseminary Podcast. Are you looking for practical ministry help to drive your ministry further, faster? Have a sinking feeling that your ministry training didn't prepare you for the real world? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others in pursuit of stuff that we wish they had taught in seminary. Buckle up, and let's get started with this week's Unseminary Podcast.
All right, well, welcome to the Unseminary Podcast. My name's Rich Birch, the host here. Don't even know my own name this morning. My name's Rich Birch, the host here at the podcast, and we're just so glad that you decided to take some time out to listen in today. We've got a great conversation lined up. I'm super excited to have Jim Tomberlin, a friend of mine, and a new friend, Tim Cool, spending some time with us today talking about a brand new book. I'm looking forward to diving in. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks, Rich.
Rich, we're not just a friend; we're an old friend. You and I've been doing this thing together for a number of years. And
Long time. It's true. It's true. Well, Tim, why don't we let you go first? Why don't you tell us a little bit about who is Tim Cool? Why did you get such a great name?
I'm not quite sure why God allowed my parents to have the last name Cool, but it is truly a cool name to have. And I've got cool kids and a cool wife, and we live in a cool house, and what could be better? And I work for Cool Solutions Group.
Nice.
And
great.
I tell you what, Rich, it has been so cool. I've been doing this now 28 years, working with churches related to their facilities, helping them think through what's the best way to utilize the tools that God's entrusted to them, and then how do they take care of those tools long term as well. So it's a combination of the planning, building, and then how do you take care of the buildings that God's entrusted to you.
Nice, very cool. Jim, why don't you give us your story? How do you describe yourself? You call yourself the Multisite guy, but give us the Jim Tomberlin story.
Well, Rich, basically my journey as the Multisite guy began as a pastor. I was a pastor for nearly 30 years, 3 decades, and had the privilege of being one of the early pioneers in the whole Multisite church movement. That's what got me invited to leave my wonderful church in Colorado Springs, Woodman Valley Chapel, to where my journey with Multisite Church started, to come to Chicago to develop the model there at Willow Creek, and 5 years later, 4 campuses later, and at the front end of that whole movement, I found myself being sought out to help churches. How do you do this multi-site thing? Mm-hmm. So for the last 10 years, I went full-time as a consultant 10 years ago, and relocated to a nice warm place in Phoenix, Arizona, Scottsdale, and have been working and serving the church around the country and beyond for the last 10 years in helping churches discern, is multi-site right for us, and if it is, how do you do it? That has morphed in some other, has created some other waves. Found ourselves doing a lot of consulting on mergers, multi-siting through mergers. Over a third of all the multi-site campuses come through as a result of a merger. And so I'm doing a lot of this merger consulting, multi-site consulting, and when you're talking about growing churches, I have the privilege of working with growing, on the most part, the exciting, dynamic, growing churches. Churches have a local expression, and they need facilities to meet in. And so I found myself having a lot of conversations and about where should we start our campuses, or where should we relocate? Where do we start a church as a church planter? And that's a facility issues. And as we've talked about in our book, probably the most expensive decision church leaders will ever make in their ministry is related to buildings and facilities. We know that church buildings don't reach people; people reach people. Mm-hmm. But Jesus said, "Wherever 2 or 3 gather in His name, there He is in the midst," and that's a place. And so there is a real physical place. And so church locality is all about facilities and location, and so we try to answer where's the best place to meet, what's the guidelines on what kind of facilities, etc. Tim, who I've had the privilege of working with over the years as well, is a specialist in so many in that whole arena. So anyway, we found ourselves just having a lot of conversations and thought, why don't we write a book about this and kind of share what we've, or at least compile a book of what we've been writing about and seen.
Very cool. Now, the name of your book is Church Locality, New Rules for Church Buildings in a Multi-Site Church Planting and Giga-Church World. Wow, that's a mouthful. Locality, church, locality. Tell me, what does that word mean? What is this, what's this book all about?
Go ahead, jump in, Tim.
Yeah, locality is kind of a play on words between location and facility. Mm-hmm. we all have to have a place to worship. I did a real informal survey with Sam Rayner, and I asked Tia and several other guys, how many churches in America meet in a building? And the best we can tell is 99 and 44/100ths of churches meet in a building. Even if you're a home church, you meet in a building.
Still meet in a building, yep.
And if you're an internet church, your servers are in a building.
Right.
So, knowing that facilities are one of your most expensive decisions, and it's generally at least your second biggest line item in your church budget after your employees and your FTEs. How can churches best think through their location tied to facilities related to them being a tool, not just a building?
Right.
They're not just a means to an, they are in sorts a means to an end, but they can also be a detrimental means to a deterioration if it's not the right locality. If it's not the right location, it just becomes a problem.
Right.
And so we wanted to be able to provide guidelines. In fact, Jim and I have laughed about this. When Jim first approached me almost a year ago, we were at a retreat together. This started off to be a white paper that turned into an ebook that then turned into a full-fledged book.
Right.
And because there's just so much information that's not available to whether you're a church planter, multi-site, or even if you're just a single location church looking to move out of a school for the first time. There's not any good information as to what's our options and how do we know what's the good options and bad options.
Absolutely, and I feel like I spend a significant portion of my time specifically, on building stuff. We're multi-site, and we've got building issues all across the board, basically at all our campuses. So this book is of huge interest. Actually, we bought it. It's one of those things we've been reading as a leadership team. So what are some misconceptions about church buildings, Jim? What are some things that might be floating out there that people are like, they're maybe held truths that aren't really true? What are some misconceptions?
Well, before I jump into that, I wanted to also say, our book really is a compilation of a number of blog postings and specific focused writings, articles about things related to facilities. But Tim and I were the biggest contributor to the book, but the third largest contributor was you.
Yes, exactly.
It was Rich Birch. Several of our chapters are from you.
Hey, I got my free book out of it, so that's good.
So, anyway, and we appreciate that. And so
it's great. Happy to help.
Some of the misconceptions. What really thing that stimulated my thinking a couple years ago about this, a book that I read that just had a profound impact upon me was Ken Follett's book.
Six Pillars.
What was that?
The Pillars book.
Yeah, but that's think of it a minute. Just think but it's a novel all about the writing, the building, a historical novel all about building. Pillars of the Earth. That's the name of the book. Pillars of the Earth, about the building of a cathedral in the Middle Ages, and it's a very well-written 1,000-page book, and just all the dynamics and issues that were going on that brought about the building of these great cathedrals in Europe.
Right.
And they were economic, they were political, they were spiritual, and really we've been the guidelines and the principles that produced those great cathedrals have been really the guidelines that we've been operating churches, building churches on for a millennium.
Right.
But all that's changed. All that's really changed in the last 20 years. And so that was one of the, I think, there's some new rules about church buildings.
Right.
But I think some of the myths that we often operated under in the last generation or so, probably one of the biggest ones, if we build it, they will come.
Right.
And I like to say that, we built these big, huge mega church campuses in the 70s, 80s, 90s in America. Why? Because we could.
Right.
The money was there, the impetus was there, the motivation was there, but the recession really has changed that thinking dramatically, as well as some other factors which we can talk about in a few moments, some other things that have changed these rules. But if we build it, they will come. But another misconception is, that's sort of a variation of that, is if we launch it, they will come. This is a danger of multi-siting churches. Hey, we got a great pastor, great church, great communicator, great ministries, and we're maxed out in our one location. If we just go open up a theater or a school or another building, 20 minutes away, people will just flock there just because we have all these great things going on. No, you still got to do the basic Church 101, good hard work of loving and serving your community,
right.
And all that. But you still need facilities and all that sort of thing. So these are a couple of the rules that obviously have misconceptions. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing too is that buildings reach people. If we just build this fabulous building,
more people will come just because
more will come because the building will overwhelm them. Maybe in some time in the past, I don't know that was ever true, but that is buildings don't reach people. People reach people.
Right.
Buildings are tools. They're a means to the end. They're not the end game. And I think one of the unfortunate realities, I think, of Western Christianity is that we have put so much emphasis. We've defined success in church work as a building.
Right.
Church building. The goal is to get to a building,
right.
And the bigger the building, the greater the success.
Right.
And yet, a big, large building will serve a growing church under a dynamic leader for maybe a decade or two or three. Mm-hmm. While that pastor's there, but often the next round, the next generation, that large building becomes unfortunately an albatross around their neck, something they can't afford, something they can't sustain. That's why we have a lot of downtown urban cathedrals empty, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I think in the next decade we're going to see a lot of super mega campuses, mega churches that have overbuilt and will not be able to sustain that. Now, the megachurch movement is not dying. Matter of fact, we're going into a Giga-Church world,
right?
Which Giga-Church is a new definition, a new word to describe churches that have over 10,000 in attendance mm-hmm. on a given weekend. A megachurch being over 2,000. And from our latest research, Outreach Magazine has defined or described, surfaced 72 Giga-Churches in America today.
Wow.
Over 10,000
wow.
attendance. Most of those are multi-site churches.
Right.
But, and that's the reason why they can get that big, because they're not limited to a building now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been amazing to watch. I noted recently that it seems like those churches that are at the very top, I'm thinking New Spring, like they don't have a massive, 10,000 seat room somewhere. They have a multiplicity of rooms across. That seems to be, at least from
right.
a layman's perspective, that seems to be, the trend. Tim, what are some of the new rules? You're obviously in the trenches, talking to a lot of churches, working with a lot of churches that are building buildings. What are some of those kind of new rules concerning church facilities? What are people building today?
Yeah, people, for example, you mentioned New Spring. I attend Elevation Church in Charlotte.
Great, yeah.
Our biggest campus is 1,100 seats.
Right.
We run 25,000 people on a weekend, with the largest worship center being 1,100 seats.
Right.
We do lots of services, but the idea was, why not have campuses that are only 35,000 square feet? So you're investing $5, $6, $7 million per campus if you're owning it and buying it or building right. it. But that makes a whole lot better sense to be able to run a campus that is, if you're running 4 services and you're pushing 3,500 to 4,000 per location per service. And most of these multi-sites, when you're in that kind of tight quarters, you're getting a higher percentage of seats being covered with butts on
right.
Sunday.
Right.
So the old 80% rule doesn't apply in those kind of settings anymore. You're getting 90, 95, even pushing 99% total coverage of seats to people, and that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, Elevation that's a perfect example. I think that I don't want people to miss what you said there. To be Elevation to run 25,000 people on a weekend, and to have the largest room be 1,100 seats, which is not a large room. It's a big room, but that's not a massive room. To build. That's incredible. Yeah. Any other trends?
Yeah, the other trends are coming out of the recession. We've seen more and more of the big box church, and that's because there was so much empty retail.
Right.
And it didn't really matter whether or not I was in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or if I was in Orlando, there was a lot of empty retail.
Right.
And so that became the natural gravitation point, particularly for planners and multi-site, is, why go buy land? And one of the examples we used in the book was showing how by going into a shopping center, you don't have to do the site work, you don't have to do the parking lot, you don't have to do all of those infrastructural type things that could run 40 to 50% of the cost of a project.
Right.
The downside of that is people just assume because it's an old retail store that it has enough parking and it's properly sprinkled and has air conditioning. And so they misconceive and this is going back to Jim's misconceptions, they misconceive as to what it really is going to cost them to get in that big box store,
right,
and they undershoot it.
Right. Okay. Very cool. Now, are there, besides the big box trend, Jim, are there other, from your vantage point, you've been through, you worked at Willow, who, they have the big room, and they have multiple smaller locations. Are there other trends that you're seeing as you're, interacting with your clients, across the country?
Well, I think just to build on what Tim was saying, the one thing is that we're seeing smaller facilities with multiple venues. And when a church, for example, is saying we want to build a 2,000 seat auditorium. I think the ideal size is around 12 to 1,500 seats maximum for most churches, but some cities will have higher people density, and et cetera. I say, if you don't put the concept of multi-site is don't put all your eggs in one location, and even in that one location, if you're going to have a lot of seats, don't put them all in one room. If you're going to have 1,800 seats, 1,500 seats, maybe you ought to do 1,000 in one room and 500 in another, and then that becomes that gives you more options, more flexibility. For worship styles, for different language groups or whatever, it gives you a lot more options. So I think there's that one. To your point, the big box, very few churches, multi-site churches, are buying land and building buildings. Right. Now we're starting to see maybe a few start to do that after 10, 15 years of being successful in a rented space, and now let's own our space, and that may make more sense. But we're seeing all kinds of usage of all different kinds of facilities. The recession did produce a lot of empty space, and I love the idea of that. We're not, the work of the church is not only about redeeming lives, that's what we're about, but we're actually redeeming space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Reclaimed space in blighted areas where there are people that need a church. This has been a great boom for local churches to be able to extend themselves into these difficult, challenging, under-resourced areas, because they're not on their own. They're part of a larger church that's, resourcing them and that sort of thing, getting them beyond survival. But we do, the primary location still, 50% of our multi-site campuses start at a school. That's starting to change a little bit, because now, as the economy is getting better, schools are less. They were desperate 10 years ago, needing the money, But clearly the trends are smaller facilities.
Right.
We don't need to build 3,000, 5,000 seat auditoriums. That day is over, in my opinion.
Yeah, let me kind of jump in on one of the things that Jim talked about, the multi-venue on the same campus. Jim and I were both consulting a church in Virginia Beach that said they needed another 200 to 300 seats in their worship center, but they also need about a 200-seat youth facility. Well, tell you what, instead of building a bigger box that's going to sit empty 5 to 6 days a week, why don't you build a 300-seat youth facility that's oversized for youth, but it becomes your second venue on campus because the youth don't meet on Sunday morning.
Absolutely.
And so that's one of the trends I think that Jim and I are both seeing more of is, you need a larger space for worship, but you're not going to build a bigger room.
Right.
Another trend along that same line, and it's related, all these things are so related, Rich. Increasingly newer churches, for sure, and a lot of the older churches are moving this direction. They're moving the youth ministry off of Sunday morning. Right. At least the high school age group. And many in the middle school, because they're for two reasons. One is that we feel like we've done a disservice to the young generation by segregating them from the rest of the church. And so when they graduate from high school, they tend to they don't come back to church because their church doesn't exist anymore. Right. But and so there's a move clearly to let's worship together, serve together as families, at least from junior high up. And then they have their own youth group or whatever on Wednesday night, Sunday night, or another night of the week. And so that student room becomes a video venue on a Sunday morning, which gives them more seats and without any more additional cost. So that's a trend that we're seeing as well. That's related to facility usage. And see, these are the kinds of things that are trained. Back in the day when I was a pastor, we intentionally built really strong youth programs on Sunday morning to complement the adult services. Now, another trend that's affecting church attendance and facilities is that today, back in the day, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was a cultural norm. Everybody went to church, and we all went and expected it. It was almost like, if you don't go to church, what's wrong with you? Today, it's you go to church, what's wrong with you? You're weird. But when people do come to church, the people we're trying to reach, they're not coming like we used to all morning, Sunday morning, 9 to noon. We all go to Sunday school, then we all go to worship, That didn't happen anymore. They come
Right.
for one service. They're going to come at that 11 o'clock, and they're going to stumble in late to that. And so you got one shot to reach those people. That later hour, 10 to 11 o'clock hour frame, is the ideal time for the unchurched people. And so you want to be ready for them. But if we're segregating the youth, and if the youth have their own service, then we're not being together. So there's that trend there of acknowledging we have our attendance, our crowd, our target is not coming to spend all Sunday morning, and they're not going to come at 9 o'clock or Saturday night, but you can get your core members to go there to create space at 11.
Very cool. Yeah, Kara Powell from Fuller wrote an incredible book called Sticky Faith that if you haven't looked into that, it explores this exact issue around young people particularly, and how do we pass the message on to the next generation. They did this great study where, to summarize it, and I'm going to butcher it, but to summarize it, they looked at young people that were still connected to their church after college or after that age bracket, and they found the thing that got them connected wasn't great, incredible, segregated student ministry. It actually was intergenerational relationships, and so her work really does challenge some of the norms, or at least some of the practices, that have been core that are obviously, that's undergirding even what we're seeing on the facility side.
Well, Rich, talking about the next generation, the latest research about the millennials, the young adults now that are coming into the church, they're much more inclined to smaller venue facilities, which is very conducive to a multi-site model.
Yep.
They're not drawn to or attracted to big mega facilities, and so this is very concerning if you're the possessor of a huge
massive building. Yep.
The next generation is not only not drawn to them, they're turned off by it.
Right.
And, now, they're not turned off by big churches that do things well, but they do it in smaller venues. It's more about high tech, but also high touch.
Right.
High community and high social engagement. And churches that are doing that, and this is one of the things that we're seeing in the list of the fastest growing churches, the largest growing churches every year that Outreach Magazine produces. There are three characteristics that are common among all those, or tend to be common among those churches. Three things that they all are doing. They are getting their people into small groups. That's that community, that relational aspect of church. They're externally focused, and they're serving their communities in high-profile ways. They're doing good in the community and bringing value to the community. And then thirdly, they're multi-siting. They're getting
absolutely.
Multiple smaller locations. They're smaller.
Cool. Well, anything else you'd like to add, Tim, before we wrap up? This has been fantastic conversation today. I'm so glad that you've decided to spend some time with us. Anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, tied to that connectivity that Jim just mentioned, one of the big facility trends that we're seeing is the larger lobby connecting spaces. When I started doing this in the idea was we would use maybe 1 to 2 square feet per person for a foyer, a narthex, if you will. Right. And in those days, it was strictly a cattle chute to get people from one part of the building outside.
Yes. Now,
the common rule of thumb is the lobby needs to be no less than 50% the size of the worship space.
Wow, that's great.
People are looking to connect. We for too many years have allowed ourselves to become backyard inhabitants. We pull in our garage at night, we put the fences up, and we go live in our backyard, and we don't communicate with each other. The millennials particularly are looking for connection to each other, and I think even people in Jim and I's age group, and you're obviously not there yet, Rich, but eventually you will be. Yes. We're looking for connectivity because we've lost it over the years.
Right.
And so being able to have spaces, and I'm not just talking a big open foyer. I'm talking about, comfy couch areas and cafe areas and little private nooks.
Conversation pits.
Exactly. People are looking to connect with each other before, after, during the week. More and more churches are saying, hey, we want to open up our lobby space for those small groups, but they don't want to meet in a classroom. They want to meet in a conversation pit.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. Well, this has been a great conversation today. I'm super excited about this conversation. I'm glad you guys you've come in and given us lots to think about. We're going to link to your book in the show notes, so you can drop by on Seminary and find that. Jim, if people want to get in touch. Oh, look at that. You got a picture of it right there. You got the actual book. Nice. Church Locality. That's great. So we'll link to that. Jim, if people want to get in touch with you, learn more about what you do from a multi-site point of view, how can they do that?
Well, you can go to my website, multisitesolutions.com. That's multisitesolutions.com, all one word, and that would be the best way to connect with me, and love to hear from you.
Great. And Tim, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, they can either go to coolsolutionsgroup.com or email me at tim@coolsolutionsgroup.com.
Nice. I really appreciate you being on the show today. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Tim, Rich.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's Unseminary podcast. Don't be shy. We'd love to connect. Check out Unseminary Inbox. You can sign up at unseminary.com and we'll send you helpful training resources every week. Plus, you'll gain immediate access to our exclusive members area with tons of resources you can use. Connect with Rich on Twitter @RichBirch or through email rich@unseminary.com. Don't forget to check out the show notes for this episode at unseminary.com. It includes links to what we talked about today and more. Leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Did you enjoy today's episode? Drop by iTunes and leave a review. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's Unseminary podcast. Join us next week when we'll learn more stuff we wish they taught in seminary.